And I just want to say a word or two, particularly for people who may not know David or may not necessarily know the history of the relationship between David and Ivan Illich, whom David will be invoking this afternoon. So I suppose the first thing to say about David is that he's a Toronto-based Canadian, a writer and a broadcaster. And, you know, over the course of a really illustrious career, it has to be said, he has interviewed some of the leading environmental experts, scientists, philosophers, and activists of our day. There are just too many, really, across the course of his 30-year career to list. But he was a broadcaster with CBC Radio One's program Ideas between 1981 and 2012. Now, another interesting feature, I think, of David's story is that in 1966, I hope I have the dates right, David, you can set me right if I've gotten this wrong. At the tender age of 20, David joined the Canadian University Service Overseas, the CUSO, one of the many volunteer organizations that sprang up in the 60s to promote international development. And 2 years later, back in Canada, he began to associate with a group of returned volunteers who experienced, as I think he had, increasing kind of reservations about this idea of international development. And a little after that, I think around about 1968 in Chicago, he first heard Ivan Illich speak. So in 1970, he and a number of his friends invited Ivan to come to Toronto for a teach-in, and I think the subject was called Crisis in Development at that time. So I think this was really the beginning of a very long and deep relationship between David and Ivan. And 18 years later, David invited Ivan to do a series of interviews for CBC Radio's Ideas program. Now, David, as well as having a deep relationship with Ivan Illich, has also written numerous books, and a number of them about Ivan himself. But the books are too, again, numerous to mention, but some for interest are The Expanding Prison, The Crisis in Crime and Punishment and Search for Alternatives, which was published in 1998. Ideas on the Nature of Science was published in 2009. The Rivers North of the Future, The Testament of Ivan Illich, was published in 2004. And again, he has more articles that I could shake a stick at, to be honest, so I'm not going to try and list them, but they've appeared in numerous Canadian publications. And again, David has spoken extensively in the US and Canada. He is very, very well placed to deliver the keynote address for us this afternoon. And it gives me great pleasure now to invite you to extend a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker this afternoon, David Cayley. David, you're very welcome. I'm now going to mute all of you and invite David to unmute himself, and we'll go to speaker view.
How did I get muted? I don't. I'm off on the foot I expected to be off on. So greetings to all wherever you are. I'm a little bit terrified. When Cormac said that I wanted to be part of the community, what he meant was that when we rehearsed on Thursday, I realized that if I was spotlighted, I would be orating to a giant effigy of my own head. And I found it so disorienting that he's made this other arrangement. I hope you can fix it, as he said, to bring me into view as I speak to you. I really have never done anything like this before in a whole life of public speaking. I've oscillated between reading, which allows you to have more nuance and know where you are, and talking extempore, which is livelier, but you're apt to go off on a tangent and forget where you are. But in this case, there was no choice, because I can't possibly read to my computer. So I'm just going to try and talk fairly freely, keeping a rough idea, I hope, where I am in the text I've prepared, which will be available later. And here goes. So Ivan Illich, I suspect, is very well. I can see faces to whom he is extremely well known, and I suspect there are others to whom he's scarcely known at all. So let me first begin by introducing my subject, and then his book, Medical Nemesis. And then we'll pause and talk a little, and then I'll go on to his revised view of his text, and then finally conclude by how I think it bears on the situation we're in today. So Ivan Illich was a man of Middle Europe. His mother was from the Jewish bourgeoisie of Vienna. His father was from the landed merchant aristocracy of Dalmatia, of what was then Yugoslavia, Split, Spalatoy. He grew up largely in Vienna, and as the daughter of a Jewish mother, found himself at the beginning of the war reclassified as a half-Jew along with the rest of his family. So they fled from Vienna to Florence. He was educated after the war in Salzburg in history and at the Gregorian theology and philosophy, and thereupon fled Rome for the United States. He was a man who was apt in every way for a career as the prince of the church, and his teachers had wished that for him, but he ran away to New York, where he, by various chances, ended up as an assistant parish priest in Washington Heights in northern Manhattan. During the Puerto Rican migration to New York, he became a spokesman of the Puerto Ricans in the New York church, and eventually ended up at the university in Puerto Rico as vice rector, where he began to do the work in the field of missiology, of mission, that occupied him for the next 15 years. He was thrown off the island in 1959 after intervening in a political conflict. The two bishops on the island on government over the issue of birth control. He offended his bishop and was sent away from Puerto Rico. He established a center in Mexico in the 60s called CDOC, which became fairly well known, and at its fullest extent was what at the time one called a free university, an ambitious publishing program, but it began as a missionary training institution. Illich's purpose in establishing it with a number of colleagues was to, he said later, subvert the church's missionary effort. Certainly he wished to criticize it as well as to support it in some aspects, and he made more and more enemies in the church during the 1960s, from whom he was protected by Cardinal Spellman, an unlikely, very devoted protector of Illich, and when he died in 1967, subjected to formal processes of inquisition, a year refused to cooperate with. A year later, a ban was placed on this center I described, CDOC in Cuernavaca, and he decided to withdraw from church service. He never renounced his priesthood, but he suspended his activities, he said, as a priest, and plain Mr. Illich. This was around the time, as Cormac related, that we met. In the early 70s, he was one of the best, he was a celebrity intellectual, one of the best known. During that period, he was a kind of jet age St. Paul, you might say, traveling, meeting a remorseless schedule of lectures, writing 5 books, of which the last is the one we're going to discuss, Medical Nemesis. The others were Celebration of Awareness, Deschooling Society, Energy and Equity, and Tools for Conviviality. And in all these books, he essentially said the same thing, which is, well, he didn't say exactly the same thing, that's misleading, but the underlying idea was that modern institution, first of all, he was a prophet, he said, of institutional rather than political revolution. That political revolution was just rearranging the furniture, whereas what he called institutional revolution was actually rethinking the institutions of our society, which he claimed were all reaching a wall at which they would become counterproductive And what he meant by that was that they would begin to get in their own way. They would become incapable of reform. They would begin to defeat their own purposes, so that education would begin to stupefy, transportation to immobilize, medical care to sicken, and so on. He put forward the idea of what he called an institutional spectrum, ranging from convivial institutions, let's say a public library, which anyone can use, but no one is compelled to use. And at the other end, a compulsory school system, which you cannot fail to attend, because if you wish to get a job, you must have a certificate from that system. So that's a mandatory system. He distinguished also between what he called liberal professions and dominant. So liberal professions had formerly been optional. You could use them if you wished, they were free, but dominant professions were compulsory and established a radical monopoly. You could not fail to use their services. You might take the example of a courtroom where you are nominally free to defend yourself, but without a lawyer, you're sunk. So that's a liberal profession, which is in fact a compulsory profession. So these ideas were put forward in a variety of books, calling for what I've called, as a kind of umbrella term, a constitution of limits. So that a roof of technological characteristics, Ivan also said sometimes, pardon me. So a stopping place, a virtue of enoughness, as one of his friends once said, Wolfgang Sachs. And it's surprisingly difficult to define what is enough, but he said it was absolutely indispensable at that moment to do so. So Medical Nemesis was one of these books, the last of them, the longest, the most scholarly. And in it, he began by saying that he considered the medical establishment had become a major threat to health. A shocking statement, and at least at the time. And he distinguished three ways in which this harm was being expressed. He virtually coined the term. It was available, but not really in use, iatrogenesis. So iatros, physician in Greek. So physician caused harm, and he divided that into three branches. The first was clinical iatrogenesis, what is commonly understood by the term, getting the wrong operation, getting the wrong drug, getting the wrong diagnosis, picking up an infection in hospital. This is not an inconsiderable problem. Ralph Nader, in an article for Harper's in about 5 years ago, estimated, I think this is probably high, he hoped to shock, but he estimated as many as 400,000 deaths in the US in a year may be caused by medical error. So I do think that's high, but for purposes of comparison, I believe there have now been about 600,000 COVID deaths. But that was shocking at the time. Now it's better known. And what Illich was really concerned with were the two other branches of iatrogenesis, which he called social and cultural. So now if I can just catch up to my place here, I'm going to read to you for a minute. Social, first of all, involves, he claimed that medicine beyond a certain scale will induce a series of socioeconomic transformations, which are made attractive, possible, or necessary by the institutional shape healthcare has taken. So I'm going to read you a long passage now that sums this up. It's a mouthful. It will give you the flavor of his very, very condensed, compact, pithy writing style. So that's an advantage, but I'm sure you can't take this all in by ear right now, but it will give you the idea. Social iatrogenesis obtains when medical bureaucracy creates ill health by increasing stress, multiplying disabling dependence, by generating painful new needs, by lowering the levels of tolerance for discomfort and pain, by reducing the leeway that people are wont to concede to an individual when he suffers, and by abolishing even the right to self-care. Social iatrogenesis is at work when healthcare is turned into a standardized item, a staple, when home becomes inhospitable to birth, sickness, and death, when the language in which people can experience their bodies is turned into bureaucratic gobbledygook, or when suffering, mourning, and healing outside the patient role are labeled a form of deviance. So that's, as I said, simple, but that was what he meant by social iatrogenesis. His final category was what he called cultural iatrogenesis. And it sets in, he writes, when the medical enterprise saps the will of people to suffer their reality. I'm going to again read, if you'll pardon me. This will is rooted in culture, which in its religious aspect offers a rationale, a style, and a community setting in which suffering can become a dignified performance. Now, what he means is that when the medical system grows too big, too intrusive, too comprehensive, the ability to suffer and the ability eventually to die compromised, are injured, are undermined. And for him, this was something he always insisted on. There's a very long chapter on death. It was not one of the parts of the book that attracted the most notice in 1975 and 76, but it's a very important essay in which he gives, in effect, a history of dying in the West. But he always insisted that dying was, he said, a transitive act, like something that I do. I can't be died. Now, I'm glad he's not alive to know that in Canada, you now can be died and that it's a constitutional right, in fact, according to our Supreme Court. But he always insisted that dying was a transitive, he said, active. It takes no object. It is something that I do. I know there can be sudden death, but that was what he insisted on. And he felt that the medical system, in attempting to indefinitely postpone dying till it became simply the cessation of treatment, the final failure, the final defeat, would fundamentally change the character of death. And it was the same, as I said before, with suffering. And it's interesting, just biographically, that Ivan had a disfiguration of his cheek, a tumor of some kind, possibly a cancer of the parotid gland, that he decided to leave untreated for reasons I won't go into now. So the last 10 to 15 years of his life, as some whose faces I can see will testify, was exactly what he called a performance, an astonishing essay in how to suffer. So he practiced what he preached. So now again, I have to see where I am. So I can't possibly hope to digest a 300-page book in a short lecture. I'd like to make two other points about medical nemesis, which I think are important, and then let's take a break. The first is that he identifies the tension within medicine between science and morality. So he claims that medicine is inevitably a moral enterprise, but in setting itself up as a techno-scientific enterprise, it creates, now that it's a techno-scientific enterprise, probably doesn't need a lot of proving to this audience. The power of diagnostic categories to slot experience into a set of stereotypes and to make these seem absolutely real, as real as can be. Second, scientific capability, techno-scientific capability very often determines the course of treatment. What is done is what can be done. And the third point is that a physician, as a scientist, becomes a member of a scientific team, according to Illich, who then has a certain interest in the conduct of the experiment. One of his interests becomes, he could be a she, obviously. The interest becomes to control the variables in the experiment, one of whom is the patient. So the patient is brought into line. And second, the vicissitudes of the experiment become the doctor's main concern, Illich says. So, and I conclude here, only a high level of tolerance, I'm quoting him now, for cognitive dissonance will allow him to carry on in the divergent roles of healer and scientist. So I think that's an important point in the book, that the doctor should be a healer, illustrates what I called earlier the moral character of medicine. Again, I'm going to read. In every society, writes, medicine, like law and religion, defines what is normal, proper, or desirable. Medicine has the authority to label one man's complaint a legitimate illness, to declare a second man sick, though he does not complain. And Illich habitually uses the default male, so I'm not going to correct for that, but you'll understand that he's doing it. And to refuse a third, social recognition of his pain, his disability, and even his death. The physician is a moral entrepreneur charged with inquisitorial powers to discover certain wrongs to be righted. Medicine, like all crusades, creates a new group of outsiders each time it makes a new diagnosis stick. Morality is as implicit in sickness as in crime or in sin. So again, you get the flavor of this powerful didactic style in which he sets out these propositions. But he insists that that is the character of medicine. So this brings me to the second and final point I want to make about the book, which is that we once called political science in early modern times moral science. So this moral character is also a political character. And he does refer to medical power as delegated power. And so the health occupations, he says, exercise a power which derives ultimately from the political sphere and which has been delegated. So to go on, he says, the medical functionary, by the ritualizing of crisis, is provided with a license that usually only the military can claim. Under the stress of crisis, the professional who is believed to be in command can easily presume immunity from the ordinary rules of justice and decency. He who is assigned control over death ceases to be an ordinary human. Because they form a charmed borderland, not quite of this world, the time span and the community space claimed by the medical enterprise are as sacred as their religious and military counterparts. So, in a footnote to this passage, Illich adds that he who successfully claims power in an emergency suspends and destroys rational evaluation. The insistence of the physician on his exclusive capacity to evaluate and solve individual crises moves him symbolically into the neighborhood of the White House. Wow. So I want to make two quick points about that. One is that that's illustrative of the whole thesis of a book in which John McKnight, who's present, also participated, called Disabling Professions, in which Illich argues that a great deal of what formerly belonged to the political sphere has migrated into the professional sphere. So what, the United States still is proud of its checks and balances within its constitutional system. Canada and the United Kingdom are equally proud of what we call our mixed institutions, and power as being checked and distributed in that system. But what Illich says is that a great deal of that power has in fact escaped, migrated into fields and is now exercised as various professional hegemonies. And you see in that passage how much power he thinks medicine exercises. The second point is when I read that first 45 years ago, that's how old the book is, I had never heard of Carl Schmitt. But Carl Schmitt was a German jurist who in 1922 wrote a book called Political Theology, in which we find the famous sentence, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." So Schmitt subsequently had a checkered career and ended up as a functionary. But his book, nevertheless, was original. And so the one who's sovereign is the one who decides on the exception. Now, but Schmitt is completely transfixed by what he calls the political, so the formerly political sphere. What I think you can get from Illich is to look elsewhere for where that sovereignty now resides. It does not necessarily reside in the political sphere. And as I'll discuss later, we've seen a compelling illustration of that in the last year. So Cormac, I'm calling you.
Here we are, David.
Let's stop for a minute after that bunch of mouthfuls.
That was a rich serving. You started us with the main course, and that's fantastic. So we're going to give people a chance to both digest and have a little bit of a palate cleanser before the next course is served. And so I'm going to offer you a very open question. And the question is, what has struck you most from what David has said so far? So a very open question. We're going to go into groups of 4, maybe some groups of 3, depending on how the numbers break. But we just like to invite you for about 8 minutes to discuss that and see where the conversation takes you. We'll hear from perhaps about 3 people when you return, and then we'll turn it back over to David again to serve the next course. So I'm going to open the rooms now, and we'll see you in 8 minutes' time. Enjoy. Wonderful. Welcome back, everyone. We're mindful that David's Wi-Fi was a little bit less optimal than we'd like. We've addressed that, we think. So it should be clearer and less glitchy for the next course. Before David goes into serving the next course, we'd love to hear from 2 or 3 people about what struck you about what David has been sharing so far. Anybody like to pitch in and tell us what's on their mind or in their heart in relation to what David has shared? We're small enough in number that you can use your on-land hand. You don't have to use any digital proxies. So we'd like to share. Timothy.
Oh, very good.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Susan, Tom, and I in our discussion had comments about that. What struck us was Tom had spoken of the depersonalization of healthcare in our system, and as Susan had also mentioned, depersonalization in order to achieve a financial maximization, which leads to then my comment was just a complete lack of accountability in terms of how are we managing patient care not only in an institutional situation, but in a community situation. We spoke a bit about the challenge at the macro level and the micro level that we saw with the COVID crisis, where the healthcare system at a macro level had horrible leadership at the national level, which impacted the good work of scientists, which has been remediated and is now moving efficiently. And just the challenges and the lack of the human care, because at the micro level, what we have found here, at least in the United States, is that a society, I think we can say in the last 40 years, is sicker, because our focus on healthcare is not holistic and not looking at the whole person, treating kind of health problems as they occur. Susan had mentioned in her work that looking at ethics in medicine in the late ancient world compared to today, as there was this, in the late ancient world, healthcare was more concerned with the person and much more holistic.
Okay. And Susan actually, Susan has her hand up to that. So why don't we use that as a segue to go to Susan? Sure. Timothy, thank you so much for starting us off and such great insights. Susan.
I think I might be a different Susan.
Or are you? Okay, well, your hand is up.
I could probably make it up, but I'd rather not.
Well, go with what you were going to say.
Yeah, so I'm a physician and my colleague in the room was a nurse. We're both educators. And we were struck by how accurate his statement was in predicting where we are now. And even beyond that, of not being professionals anymore, we're providers. And that the industrial complex has really gone beyond us to now where algorithms are making decisions about, who lives and who dies, and coverage depends on it. And the other area we spoke about was the idea that people don't die anymore, they pass. In conversations with baby boomers in general, and so many of us have been separated from the act of dying, that when we talk about it or we deal with it, they pass. And it's been a real issue for the healthcare providers, professionals, everybody at the bedside during COVID, because death is the enemy, it's a failure, and we have lost the training to be able to provide that kind of comfort care. So your comments and the author really took us down the path of to the bedside of the patients and how we're failing them.
Powerful. Thank you. So death is being outsourced. Let's hear from one other person before we hand back to David to serve us up with another fine course. Anybody else like to? Michael, your hand is up.
We talked about a number of different things. Birgit asked about the implications of Illich's work for working at community level initiatives and empowering communities to do better things that have been perhaps absorbed institutionally. We talked a little bit about Professor McKnight's work and I think the larger critique of modernity that underlays both the critique of medicine and the earlier critique of development that Ivan Illich offered. David was wondering about the utility of reading Illich early versus his interlocutors later, and whether there's a positive component to his work rather than simply a critique of institutions and their power. And Professor Mostu noted that David Cayley was the only intellectual she ever met at Harvard, which which deserves recognition.
Well, that's a very fine segue to hand back to David. And what I'll do is I'll make sure that on the next round we'll hear from other voices. So I'll do my best to include as many of you as possible. But I wanted to defer to David's time as our keynote speaker. So David, I'm sure that gives you plenty to include in your next remarks. So over to you.
Well, can you hear me? Yes,
you're coming
good.
through.
Okay,
Yes.
so that's very apt to what I was going to say. I will answer the one thing that was just said, which is because John McKnight is in the audience. It was a remark that John quoted to me of Ivan's that I included in my first broadcast with him, which was Ivan telling him that he was a proscriptive rather than a prescriptive thinker. So the answer, did he have a positive program, is I think largely no. He felt people could devise proper institutions if only they knew where what was proscribed, where the limits, the things that wouldn't work were. So he wasn't a positive thinker. I don't know if I was really the only intellectual that Pat Mostu ever met at Harvard or not. But I want to now talk about medical nemesis as Illich saw it in the second phase of his work. He was a number of times asked to reconsider it, lecture on it, and so on. On one such occasion, 10 years later, he said, "I'm not dissatisfied with my text as far as it goes, but I am distressed that I was blind to a much more profound symbolic iatrogenic effect, the iatrogenesis of the body itself. I overlooked the degree to which, at mid-century, the experience of our bodies and ourselves had become the result of medical concepts and cares." So that addresses the subject that a couple of people mentioned of depersonalization. He came to the conclusion that he had not, under various influences I haven't been into, that he had taken the body for a natural fact, standing outside history, and that he now felt that in fact we live in what he called an epoch-specific body. That is, we live in the body of our times, as it were, and not in a body that's always the same. And he secondly felt that that self-perception was being medicalized as never before, so that he re-evaluated the whole enterprise of medical nemesis in two ways. One, he felt, well, let me take a step before I go into that. This was part of a broader sense, a conclusion that he came to in the 1980s. He described it to me this way in 1988. He said, "I believe that there has been a change in the mental space in which many people live." I'm hearing something strange here. "I believe that there has been a change in the mental space in which many people live. Some kind of a catastrophic breakdown of one way of seeing things has led to the emergence of a different way of seeing things. The subject of my writing has been the perception of sense in the way we live. And in this respect, we are, in my opinion, at this moment, passing over a watershed I had not expected in my lifetime to observe this passage." So he feels the world has entered a new era, which he calls the age of systems, which brings to a conclusion an approximately 800-year period, which he would call the age of tools. This is a profound transformation that has occurred. And its character, above all, is embodied in this word system. He said people had been swallowed by the system. He spoke of an ontology of systems. He was very struck by how you and I refer to my system, or one refers familiarly to the ecosystem. So the language of systems, in a way, sums this up. So you perhaps can see that in Medical Nemesis, he's still writing as if he were addressing citizens standing outside a tool, an immense tool, the medical system, but still something conceived instrumentally, something they might change, something they might, if they form a political majority, decide to alter, right? Something from which they stood apart. He now saw them as swallowed by the system. So this comes now to this theme of depersonalization, right? So it made no sense to say the medical establishment is the major threat to health. He said now, in his opinion, the major threat to health was the pathogenic pursuit of health itself. And I think he was serious about that. So he felt, in effect, that a unique, personal, fleshy embodiment, me, was turning into a kind of informational abstract, a kind of collage of risks, averages, probabilities under the impactized medicine. Scan, the prediction, the risk. Now, I think probably the best way to get at that shortly is to talk about the concept of risk, because that was very central for him. He said it was the most powerfully what I gotta find this exact phrase. The most religious, in his words, about the most powerful religiously celebrated ideology today, he said. So he was very shocked to meet a young colleague in Germany who was studying genetic counseling for pregnant women who were being advised about the risks. They were not obliged to do anything about it, but they were legally obliged in Germany at the time, this would have been in the 80s and 90s, to have counseling and to be made aware of all the risks pertaining to their pregnancy. And as Ivan began to reflect on this, he saw that no personal statement was being made. People were being told about what might happen to somebody like you, make a decision. So this is an actual case of what he called disembodiment. Risk does not pertain to me. Risk pertains to the population to which I belong, in which something may happen to someone like me with a predictable frequency. It has nothing to do with me. And one of the people who spoke earlier said, spoke of algorithms. Well, that's a classic case of that. So this was utterly shocking to him. I mean, and changed in a way everything for him, that would live in view of risks. And so that's really, really important. Now, Illich was a man who liked to move on. He liked to be in the moment. He liked to address the conditions of the moment. It's sometimes to a fault, I would say. So it led him sometimes to exaggerate and say, well, medical nemesis was just dead written stuff of the 70s. You probably have already gathered that I don't take that view at all, that I think it's a wonderful and rich text, but it does need to be supplemented by this understanding of our new condition. The second, I think, really important part of that new condition has to do with life. Sometime in the mid-'80s, Ivan was approached after he lectured in the South. I think it was the only time he ever lectured in the South. A minister called Will Campbell. Maybe some of you will know about Will Campbell. And Campbell approached Illich after lecture and said, life is tearing the church apart. I want you to come and address an ecumenical meeting on the subject, which Illich obediently did. And that text has not, we don't have that text, but he did the same in Chicago in 1989 at a Lutheran convocation. And there he said that he considered life to be the greatest idol that the church had faced in her history. So this was an astonishing statement to me, but he did not find much uptake at the time in this position. What he argued, I can only this briefly, the essay addressed to the Lutherans is in a book called In the Mirror of the Past, if anybody wants to look it up. He claimed that life for his contemporaries had become palpable, had become a manageable stuff, something that could be administered, something that a court could find. This can be done in about 4 US states, I believe, that there had been wrongful life, something that life had become somehow palpable, stuffy, substantive, he said, and therefore administrable. It was a resource, obviously, in advertising, in corporate mission statements. To take a very old example, Coke adds life is an example of that. But he said life had become an idol. Now, this brings me to a second point, which is also I don't have really a lot of time for. Illich considered the modern West to be a perverse form of the Christian gospel and the Christian church. So modernity, he called it with me once my hypothesis that modernity can be studied as an extension of church history. And likewise, he thought that many of our concepts were not really understandable, not fully understandable, unless you understood in what way they were displacing concepts in Christian theology. So life is in God, life is in Christ. It's explicit in the New Testament. And that is, in a sense, the only life. And so that life, it would be not, I'm making a mess of this. It would not be possible for people to speak as they do now had there not been that conceptual space created by the church. But now what we were dealing with was an idol. So I don't feel I've said that very well, but it's very important because he wasn't listened to. I thought it was just astonishing what he was saying. I put on a radio program in 1992 on this theme. I interviewed him. It's a long interview. It forms the last chapter of the Ivan Illich in Conversation, if anyone wants to look at it. And it went over like a lead balloon. It was the least commented, least noticed, least regarded program I ever broadcast during a long career. And I thought, well, he's right. This somehow can't be brought up. Now, that may have changed now, which is very interesting, that this may be now something that can be discussed. But anyway, it was a very, very important point for him, that we are in what he dared to call a new religiosity. He didn't speak of a religion, but of a religiosity, meaning a religious atmosphere, and that life is the fetish, he liked to use that word, of this new religion. So this becomes very important when we come to the final phase of our discussion in talking about how we have behaved in this pandemic and the figure of saving lives, which dominates every other concern. So since it's already 6:45, Cormac, I think we'll call that the second course. And if you want to break again, and then I'd like to do a final section.
Great. And can I just check, David?
Time is a little short, I think.
It is, yeah. So I'm just wondering if we might go ahead and do the next piece now, and then we can have some time for questions at the end.
I think that would be better.
Let's do that
Yeah,
then. If that feels, people are nodding, so I think we have support for that. Okay.
Okay, good. All right.
You're on a roll.
So,
let's keep going.
So I believe that this was true for me, that it's easier to understand the current conjuncture, the way people have behaved in this pandemic and the way political power has been exercised and medical power, if you put the two pieces that I've tried sketchily to lay out together. That was the case for me. I'm going to make some assumptions about the pandemic. I'm sure they're not shared by all by any means. I haven't time to argue them, so I'm going to just lay them out as assumptions and then say how I think Illich bears on them. The first thing, which was so striking to me, is that almost instantly, a year and a bit ago, we adopted a completely novel policy as if it was obvious and commonsensical. Older people, retired often from public health, some of them very eminent, said, we've never quarantined healthy before. This is a complete, untried novelty. And yet it seemed perfectly obvious that it should be done that way. And in a similar way, to make it an objective of public policy, let's say, to flatten the curve, which was all said obsessively in Canada, that we were going to flatten the curve, right? Or we were going to protect the healthcare system. So people are sick, so what do we need to do? We need to protect the healthcare system. These were strange, counterintuitive, and yet somehow strangely obvious objectives. The second very striking thing for me is that there was scientific disagreement from the very beginning. Eminent epidemiologists, beginning with John Ioannidis from Stanford, said, don't go over a cliff here before you know what this is. You have no idea what's happening here. You have no idea of the infection mortality rate. You have no idea of the costs of the policy you're implementing. You're really in the dark, so don't go off half-cocked. Subsequently, many virologists, epidemiologists, immunologists expressed reservations, tried to speak. This was, in Canada, I can't speak for the US, pretty much systematically suppressed. There has been no scientific disagreement has leaked into our public discourses, certainly not at the CBC where I worked all my life. So we have a strange situation where we believe we're following science, and yet we suppress the point that medical doctors and distinguished epidemiologists are taken off YouTube now. They're actually censored. This has happened in the last weeks. So that's point two. The third is that moral questions about who is benefiting, who is harmed, what is this going to cost, and so on, have been more or less set aside under cover again of following the science. Elementary cultural forms and basic decencies, accompanying the sick, being with the dying, allowing church services, whatever it might be, have been set aside as obviously necessary, no question. Many people in Canada, old people, died alone without even access to those closest to them, and that was taken as necessary and obvious. And the fifth axiom or assumption seems to just be there, is the willingness of people to see themselves as a kind of gigantic immune system. So it's gone down very smoothly with the Canadian public, as far as I can see, that you are, and you have to act as if everything you do is a danger to others. You have to think of yourself as a cell or a particle in a gigantic and even global immune system. So don't think of yourself as a citizen, a parent of an institutionalized elder, whatever. Think of yourself as part of this social immune system in which you are being responsibilized. So when I thought about it, I thought, well, this is exactly the new mentality Ivan said was coming, said was there, and had been establishing itself as a set of habits of thought for 20, 30, 40 years. And now suddenly it appears as obvious, as something we don't need to discuss, something which in fact you're a bit of a heretic if you try to discuss it. And so, so what are some of those assumptions? Well, that risk had to be averted at all costs. So risk was taken for granted. That safety was the preeminent aim of public policy, that we had to be safe, this is constantly reiterated now. It's become, yours truly has become stay safe. So there's the safety emphasis, and there's the saving of lives. And finally, I would say that the pandemic could be and must be intensively managed, that it was utterly irresponsible to think of cautiously, I want to underline cautiously, enduring it or living through it. That was not possible. Taking care of one another, taking care of ourselves, of course, but not this idea that it could be, it must be managed, and it must be intensively managed, and that every change in the behavior of this natural thing, this virus, what could be laid at the door of a politician that they failed to manage. So my argument is that these have become entrenched habits of thought, a kind of common sense, and that's why a policy that was an inversion of common sense in public health could be implemented without anybody seemingly noticing that this was in fact a revolutionary inversion. So I haven't much time, so I'm going to just highlight two things that I think are important. Illich, in a book called Tools for Conviviality, laid out three, he called them conditions for recovery. By recovery, he meant something like reinhabitation. What would be the characteristics of a society able to live within the human condition and on the earth and endure? So 3 conditions for recovery. One of them was called getting over the delusion about science. He used that expression, the delusion about science. Now that delusion, this is not an anti-scientific statement, is that science is a special kind of knowledge that trumps every other kind of knowledge and is in fact simply knowledge. It is mandatory for all at all times. He claimed that that assumption disabled political and moral judgment, which is really the second point, which is that there has been, in Canada at least, I wanted to speak for my local scene here, no opportunity to debate, to discuss questions which I claim are moral and subject to judgment. So what are we talking about? Well, we've accumulated debt and are continuing to accumulate it on a scale which is almost unthinkable and with unforeseeable consequences as far as I can tell. We have virtualized a huge amount of life in ways that people now claim will have to continue, and this is the new form in education and so on. I mean, massive social changes have come under the cover of this emergency, and many people are now insisting that it'll have to stay that way, right? So the performing arts in Canada have been absolutely devastated. Livelihoods and businesses have been wantonly destroyed. The old have been abandoned largely and left to die alone. So there have been increases in every kind of problem that you would expect from social isolation, addictions, homelessness, domestic violence, other diseases out of control. So what, you know, the nasty visits of politics is to weigh these things up, is to look them in the eye and say, what are we doing here? And this has been impossible in Canada. So we're clearly in the presence of some kind of inhibiting sacred which prevents discussion or pushes it to the political right, which is distressing for those of us who are as much identified with the left as with the right. And so that's really, in brief, my argument. Now, back in the day when I was making radio programs, I was very often told by producers, well, we're going to need an ending. We need an upbeat ending. It's kind of a downer. Can you give us an upbeat ending? And I would always try to devise something. And I'm a bit at a loss for an upbeat ending, except that in my mind, and you can probably tell from what I've said how dire I think this situation is, that this is so bad that perhaps it's good. That this is a revelatory window into where we've got to, and that after this is over, because there's no stopping it now, at least in Ontario, after this is over, there is going to perhaps be a reckoning. And I think Illich's concepts I know they're radical, but I think they will be pertinent to that discussion occur. And I thank you for your attention and patience.
David, thank you. Some really, really powerful reflections there, particularly at the end as you brought it home to us, how Illich, the great luminary that arches over us, can help us interpret what's happening. I feel that we're left with as many questions, perhaps, as answers, but I wanted to very briefly turn to give the floor to John McKnight, if he has a mind to say anything as we come to the end. And I'm just curious, John, as you listened, did anything in particular strike you? And is there anything you'd like to share in response to David's presentation?
I've taken 4 pages of notes. It's been illuminating for me. David ended with the idea that it may be that what's happened is so bad that it may be good, that it is so extreme that the result may be after the virus recedes, a new reckoning, new discussion. What did we do? Why? I know that Yvonne often talked about a possibility in the future in which these ever-growing sovereignties of professions and institutions had extended themselves so far beyond any possibility of achieving what they claim, that they would collapse. And that we would see a more popular sense of capacity among local citizens, because people would begin to see the Wizard of Oz, the imperial pretensions of the systems, and that they would begin to break down. I wonder, David, do you see that?
Am I on here?
Yeah.
You're
Can
on
you hear
there,
me, John?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. I hope so. I do. I live in hope, as you know, right?
Yes.
You're just a cheerful, optimistic soul. So yes, I think so, but I think it may take place in monastic pockets, not monasteries in the old medieval sense, but some new form of community in which we cherish one another and take care of one another and live differently, and that those may grow as seeds of a new society. It's hard to be more optimistic than that. But yes, I see that happening and feel myself to be part of it. Just when I see your face, even.
Good. Right.
Bringing it back to the personal and the local. And I saw, if I may take the luxury of going to John Ahern, a fellow Irishman who tried to come in earlier, and I'll give you the last word, John. Particularly struck when David mentioned monastic life and the possibility of monastic connection. And you were particularly well versed, I think, in that way of living. So I wonder, would you have some thoughts to share from a Celtic spirituality perspective?
Well, before I go on to that, I want to thank David. I want to thank you, Cormac, for being moderator. And I want to refer back to one thing earlier, the death as a transitive act, and gives the illustration of both my own parents, because both of those decided when they would die. Mom was 91, and one evening I went into her and I said that Bridge Casey is dead. And I didn't know that she had, she would have been a neighbor, we'll say. But my mom said, oh, my best friend is gone. I wonder, can I go too? And from that day on, it was downhill. And she died actually 5 weeks later. It was a little process. The other one was my dad. He was 98 3/4, and he was getting very tired of being around. And I was lucky to be home that time to kind of help them out, because it would be too much of my sister. Now, we kept them at home the whole time. Neither went into a nursing home. If Dad had gone into a home, from a farming background, as you know, Cormac, but the other people wouldn't know. If Dad had gone into a home, he would feel evicted from his own home, and he wouldn't have lasted a week, actually. So he was at home the whole time. But he felt that he was preventing me from getting on with life, which wasn't true. I was quite happy to be there, but he got this into his head. And my nephew was in Australia that year for a year. And Dad said to me one evening around October, he says, like, when will Padraig be home? And Padraig wasn't to be home until Christmas time. And I said, he won't be home till Christmas. He says, well, I won't be there then. And he was absolutely adamant about it. There was nothing physically wrong with him, if you like, other than old age and being a little bit slow. Mine perfectly clear. And I was kind of trying to motivate him to go on living, saying that when he would be 100, that he'd get 2,000 euro from the president. It meant, it's true. We do this in Ireland. Actually. That's right. But it meant nothing to him. He said, like, what good is that to me when I can't even count it? And I can't spend it. I said, all those people will spend it for you. But anyway, we told Padraig, and Padraig came home actually in November. And at the winter solstice, Dad died, and he was buried on Christmas Eve. That's just about dying transitively. Now, to come to the monastic thing, that's very interesting, because D.H. Lawrence said a long time ago, that the adventure has gone out of Christianity. And not everybody would agree with him. And one man, and I'd introduce everybody very quickly to a man called John Moriarty, Moriarty. John Moriarty.
I know it's writing. Yeah.
He's not very well known abroad, even though he lectured in Canada. He was lecturing after 6 years in the University of in Winnipeg, in the University of what was it?
Manitoba.
Manitoba. Absolutely. Yeah. John Moriarty, 1938 to 2007. No, seriously, any of you there, if you get into his works, you'll be just amazed, because he's a tremendous philosopher that isn't well known, actually. But he had a vision for what he called a Christian monastic head school. He actually felt that we need to start all over again, and it should. John there mentioned it in the small pockets, or was it yourself, David, mentioned that the small monastic pockets? That was his idea. But John Moriarty, it was staying in it was watching with Christ. It's really the Triduum Sacrum would be in fact, it would even replace the Mass. We know we Catholics and Christians generally use the Eucharist as our ritual to celebrate the Paschal Mystery, the 3 great days of the Triduum Sacrum, which we celebrated recently in Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday, and Easter morning. And for John Moriarty, no, they weren't the central ones. He find the Mass too exclusive because there's so many people can't celebrate it. But the Triduum, the Tenebrae, which was a ritual that you had in the Middle Ages, anybody can be at that. And what he would be celebrating there would be his view of, and if I'm going on too long, please stop me, Cormac. I'll finish.
We will have to stop now.
Just with three more
John,
sentences, maybe.
Great.
John's view was that he looked on Jesus and what he did and what he underwent. He said, in fact, the Gospels don't really tell us about it. The Gospels tell us about the 14 stations of the Christian cross and the journey to Calvary and all the rest. Focus on the external suffering. But what did he undergo internally? And he says, it is the work of the mystics, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Hildegard of Bingen, all these. It is their work. When they underwent the dark night of the soul, that's really what Jesus suffered, you know. And the image John uses is going Grand Canyon deep in the world's karma when he's in Gethsemane and he's healing all towards God. He goes right back to the beginning of creation and healing everything, you know, gone down through all the strata of the earth there. And he's also coming forward to the end. Like in Gethsemane, Jesus is actually as far as Auschwitz, or he's as far as Myanmar today, or any other difficult, and he's healing it all. And then, of course, in Golgotha, and then the re-emerging in the Guard of the Sepulchre. But anyway, if you had these little monastic communities, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long.
No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry.
Thanks.
All we're sorry for is we don't have more time. It's beautiful.
Look into John Moriarty, M-O-R-I-A-R-T-Y, 1938. There's a video on YouTube.
I'll put a reference. Yeah, that's great, John. Thank you so much. David, thank you very much. It's been a fantastic lecture. Please go ahead, and we'll wrap up.
I think you should have asked John Ahern to lecture, not me.
No, David, stop. David, you did a great job, David. You did a great job. Thanks.
Well, we have 21.
Thank you too. Well,
we have 21 wise souls, David, but you did a great job in creating space for us to think, and you gave us a lot to think about this evening. And invoking Ivan Illich is just such a gift to us all. He's the luminary that arches over us, and you're the luminary that was among us this afternoon, keeping us connected and thinking. Can I just mention that David has written a new book called Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey. And if this has whetted your appetite, I would encourage you to go out and get a copy of that book. I think Bill Kavanagh has reviewed the book very favorably as well. And it just falls to me to say, David, thank you so much. And to everybody who's here today, thank you all very, very much for a very stimulating afternoon. Well done, David. Thank you.
Thank you. Greetings to all. I wish I could be there with you. Goodbye.
Take care, folks.
It's good night here.